They didn't replace you. They downgraded themselves and called it freedom. Chosen ones, let's call this what it really is. They sold gold for glitter and convinced themselves it was an upgrade. That's the headline. That's the truth they avoid, and the truth you don't need to chase. If you're wondering why it happened, why it felt so sudden, why it made no sense, here's the answer they'll never say out loud. They didn't betray you because you were lacking. They betrayed you because you were expensive, not in money, in presence, in standards, in self-respect, in the kind of depth that charges interest over time. Here's the part that hits them hardest. Your absence is louder than any argument you could have made. Regret doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream or post or confess. It sits quietly at night, replaying the moment they chose comfort over character and called it confidence. And no, betrayal rarely comes from hatred. Hatred is loud and honest. Betrayal comes from weakness, wearing a tailored suit. It comes from people who want the reward without the responsibility, the applause without the effort, the feeling of winning without actually becoming better. Let's answer the question running through your mind right now. Did they find someone better? No, they found someone easier. Easier to impress, easier to control, easier to keep around without changing anything about themselves. They found someone who clapped on cue, laughed a little too hard, agreed a little too fast, and never asked them to rise. That's not chemistry, that's convenience with good lighting. And convenience is seductive to people who are tired of pretending they're growing. There's a reason this happens so often. When people are faced with growth versus comfort, the mind leans toward whatever costs the least emotional energy. Growth demands honesty. Comfort offers relief. Relief feels good. Relief feels like winning. And that's how people trade depth for decoration and call it an upgrade. It's how they mistake noise for connection and validation for alignment. They didn't make a strategic move. They took a shortcut and wrapped it in confidence. A clearance bin decision with a luxury brand ego. At first, it felt like a win for them. New attention, new excitement, new energy, the kind that sparkles for a moment and fades, the second real life shows up without filters. Let's be real, the fake came with benefits. No accountability, no depth, no uncomfortable self-reflection. Just vibes, selfies, and a shared agreement to ignore red flags as long as the compliments kept coming. That's not connection. That's emotional fast food. It tastes good going down and leaves you empty an hour later. Now here's where your power shows. You didn't explode. You didn't beg. You didn't campaign for sympathy or turn your pain into a performance. You did the most dangerous thing imaginable. You stepped back. You detached, you elevated, you let silence do the talking and time do what it always does best, expose shortcuts. Time doesn't argue, time doesn't explain, time collects receipts. Quietly, patiently, relentlessly. This is where their regret slips in without permission. Not because they miss the chaos or the drama, but because the replacement can't carry weight. Conversations feel thin, loyalty feels optional, depth gets replaced with performance, and suddenly the memory of you isn't nostalgic, it's instructional. You weren't just someone they lost. You were the standard they ran from. You represented a version of life that required them to grow up, show up, and be honest, and they weren't ready to pay that price. Let's clear something up for you right now. This isn't about revenge, it's about reality. They didn't betray you and win. They betrayed you and postponed their own evolution. And postponement always charges interest. There are no refunds for wasted potential, no exchanges for missed growth, no store credit for integrity once it's sold. If you're asking, why does this hurt if I'm chosen? Because being chosen doesn't mean being spared. It means being refined. It means you don't get to stay where it's small, shallow, or convenient. Your role isn't to be consumed, it's to be catalytic. And catalysts are never appreciated by those who fear transformation. Here's the truth that fuels you forward. You don't need to prove your value to people who chose the fake. Their choice already did that for you. You don't chase clarity, you become it. You don't argue with misalignment, you outgrow it. And while they replay their decision in quiet moments they can't escape, you keep moving, stronger, sharper, and unmistakably rare. They didn't walk away from you because you were too much. They walked away because you were the one thing they couldn't fake their way through. And that's not a loss, that's confirmation. Before we move forward, take a moment to support this message and the energy behind it. If this video hit home, like it so it reaches others who need this clarity. Subscribe to the channel so you stay connected to content that sharpens your mindset, strengthens your identity, and keeps you moving forward. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their value right now. And if you want to support the team directly, consider sending a super thanks. Your support helps us keep investing time, effort, and creative energy into bringing you powerful, life-changing, and motivating videos like this, consistently and without compromise. Number 1. They didn't walk away for something better. They walked away from something that exposed them. When someone escapes you, it's usually because you showed them who they really are. Chosen ones hear this clearly because this is where the story stops being confusing and starts being empowering. They didn't walk away because you were missing something. They walked away because you exposed something, and that truth hits harder than any insult ever could. People don't abandon real depth for something fake unless the real thing makes them uncomfortable. And you made them uncomfortable in the most dangerous way possible by being solid, aware, and uncompromisingly real. Let's answer the question that keeps circling your mind. Why would someone choose something fake over something real? Because fake is manageable. Fake is adjustable. Fake doesn't look back at them and reflect the parts they've been avoiding. You did. And that kind of reflection is terrifying to people who survive by pretending. You weren't too much. You were too clear, too present, too aligned. Being around you required them to show up fully, and that level of presence felt like pressure because it demanded honesty they weren't prepared to give. Here's the truth they won't say. Control feels like safety to someone who is internally unstable. The fake didn't challenge their habits, didn't interrupt their cycles, didn't notice the cracks in their character. The fake agreed quickly, adapted instantly, and never asked questions that forced growth. That's not chemistry, that's convenience. And convenience is irresistible to people who are running from themselves. With you, there was nowhere to hide. Your clarity highlighted their contradictions. Your standards reminded them of promises they never kept to themselves. You weren't correcting them, you weren't policing them, you were simply existing with integrity, and that alone felt like an audit they didn't consent to. So instead of rising to meet you, they retreated to something they could manage, something predictable, something that bent when they pushed. They mistook control for peace. They confused predictability with stability. But real stability doesn't come from managing someone else. It comes from inner alignment. And that's exactly what they lacked. So they chose an external solution to an internal problem, hoping a change of scenery would quiet the noise they refused to confront. At first, it looked like they won. No friction, no accountability, no growth pains, just smooth conversations and surface-level comfort. Everything felt easy. And that's the trap. Ease without substance always feels like freedom in the beginning. But ease that requires no growth eventually becomes a cage. Over time, the fake stopped being impressive. The agreement started feeling hollow. The control became boring. And boredom is where regret quietly takes root. Because repetition without depth has a way of shrinking a life. Here's the part that should fuel you. Controlling someone doesn't make life easier, it makes it smaller. There's no expansion there, no evolution, no real connection, just performance on repeat. And that's when your absence becomes loud. Not because you chased, explained, or tried to be understood, but because you represented something they couldn't dominate: authenticity, presence, a standard that didn't bend to their comfort. They didn't lose you because you were lacking. They lost you because you wouldn't shrink to fit the version of life they were settling for. If you're wondering, why does it still sting if I know my worth? Because awareness doesn't erase impact. But understand this: the sting isn't a sign of loss. It's a sign of separation from what was never meant to contain you. Being chosen doesn't mean being kept. It means being revealed. It means you're not built to be managed, muted, or molded. You're built to expose, elevate, and move on. And here's what hits them hardest, even if they never admit it. You didn't break. You didn't beg. You didn't compete. You stayed intact. You kept your shape. You didn't trade your clarity for their comfort. That's what they couldn't handle then, and that's what they can't escape now, because everywhere they go, every shallow connection they entertain, every controlled dynamic they create is quietly compared to the depth they walked away from. So let this be the moment you stop internalizing their decision. It wasn't a rejection of you, it was a confession of their limits. You were the mirror they didn't want to face, and the standard they weren't ready to rise to. And that's not a flaw, that's power. Number 2, the betrayal wasn't emotional. It was a survival move. Some people don't betray because they're cruel. They betray because they're cornered by who they are. Chosen ones, this is where the confusion finally clears. What happened to you wasn't an emotional impulse. It wasn't rage, jealousy, or some dramatic collapse of feelings. It was a calculated act of survival. Not your survival, theirs. You were standing on a level that demanded truth, awareness, and internal strength. And simply being near you exposed how unprepared they were to operate there. That kind of exposure doesn't feel romantic or exciting. It feels threatening. It shakes the identity they carefully constructed to function without changing. Your presence required courage. It required reflection. It required consistency. And that kind of pressure doesn't register as inspiration to someone who has been avoiding themselves for years. It registers as danger. Being around you meant they couldn't hide behind excuses, distractions, or shallow narratives about who they were becoming. You reflected back the gaps between who they claimed to be and how they actually lived. That gap is exhausting for someone whose entire system is built on avoidance. So let's dismantle the lie right now. They didn't leave to hurt you. They left to protect the version of themselves that couldn't survive your clarity. You forced a confrontation they didn't ask for and weren't ready to face, and instead of rising, they retreated. Not because you were cruel or demanding, but because you were honest. You didn't bend reality to make them feel comfortable. You didn't shrink your standards to preserve their illusion of stability, and that made staying feel like a constant internal threat. Here's what they actually wanted, even if they couldn't articulate it. They wanted emotional padding, noise, distraction, a space where nothing asked too much of them, where discomfort could be numbed instead of examined. Betrayal became the fastest route there. It allowed them to escape the tension of growth while convincing themselves they were still okay, still progressing, still winning. Choosing the fake wasn't about connection. It was about relief. Relief from accountability. Relief from reflection. Relief from the quiet pressure your presence applied just by being real. And the cruel irony is that they likely reframed the story in their own mind to make it easier to live with. They told themselves you were intense, that your expectations were unreasonable, that loyalty was restrictive, that depth was overrated. In their narrative, they weren't turning away from truth. They were choosing peace. But peace built on avoidance is temporary anesthesia, not healing. They didn't select something healthier. They selected something quieter, something that wouldn't ask them to grow up. That choice felt smart in the moment. It felt like self-care. It felt like survival. But survival without evolution eventually turns into stagnation. And stagnation always comes with a cost. The weight of that decision didn't hit them immediately because consequences that involve identity never arrive loudly. They show up slowly, in moments where the replacement can't hold a serious conversation. When challenges surface and there's no depth to lean on. When real life demands honesty and the person beside them only knows how to distract. That's when regret starts forming, not as longing, not as romance, but as recognition. Recognition that they abandoned something rare to avoid facing themselves. Every difficult moment now highlights the absence of what you brought effortlessly: consistency, insight, substance, and the regret cuts deeper because it's not about missing you. It's about realizing they undermined their own potential just to stay comfortable. This is where you need to recalibrate how you see yourself in this story. Their betrayal didn't define your value. It revealed their limits. You weren't rejected. You were escaped. You weren't too demanding. You were too clarifying. You didn't ask for perfection. You represented honesty. And honesty is intolerable to someone surviving on illusion. You were never the problem they solved by leaving. You were the mirror they couldn't look into without seeing what they were avoiding. And mirrors don't soften the truth to protect fragile egos. They reflect what's there, cleanly, unapologetically. That's your power, and that's exactly why they ran. Number 3. They gave up depth for applause and called it a win. They traded substance for claps and mistook noise for victory. Chosen ones understand this clearly, so it settles in your bones. They didn't walk away chasing something higher, they walked away chasing something louder. What they wanted wasn't depth, it was reaction. Not connection, but confirmation. Not growth, but applause. You carried weight. You brought consistency, patience, and a presence that asked people to rise instead of perform. And that's exactly why they couldn't stay. Depth doesn't flatter insecurity. Depth exposes it. Here's the truth most people don't like admitting. Being truly known is far more intimidating than being temporarily admired. You required time, you required effort, you required honesty. And time is something impatient people resent. Effort is something undisciplined people avoid. And honesty is something unhealed people run from. So they chose the shortcut. They chose someone who celebrated them without understanding them, who praised them without challenging them, who admired the surface and never asked what was underneath. Applause is seductive because it's instant. It asks for nothing in return, no accountability, no reflection, no growth. Just show up, smile, and be affirmed. That kind of validation hits fast and fades faster, but in the moment it feels like winning. The fake could echo their opinions, mirror their habits, and validate every version of themselves they didn't want to question. That felt powerful to them. That felt like control. And for a short while, it probably felt like success. But what you offered wasn't loud. It was solid. And solidity doesn't compete with noise. It outlasts it. Substance doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself over time. It shows up in consistency, in loyalty when it's inconvenient, in truth when it would be easier to lie. Being connected to you meant being seen beyond the highlight reel. It meant owning flaws, staying present during discomfort, and committing to growth even when it wasn't glamorous. They weren't prepared for that kind of responsibility. Ask yourself this: why would someone abandon something real for something shallow? Because shallow feels safe to those who are afraid of being stretched. You weren't rejected because you lacked value. You were avoided because your value demanded maturity. Being around you meant they couldn't hide behind charm or momentum. It meant they had to slow down and confront who they were becoming or failing to become. Over time, the truth always shows up. The cheers get quieter. The excitement loses its spark. The admiration turns repetitive, and the person they chose can't sustain what they never had to build. That's when the emptiness becomes obvious, when loyalty is missing, when depth is absent, when the connection feels hollow despite all the smiles. That's when regret takes shape. Not loudly, not publicly, but internally, where there's no audience to impress. Here's the part that should strengthen you. They didn't just give up a person, they surrendered momentum. They let go of evolution. They exchanged long-term expansion for short-term approval. And that decision always comes with a cost. Applause doesn't carry you through challenges. Attention doesn't build resilience. Validation doesn't replace alignment. And the very things they chased begin to feel meaningless once reality demands more than performance. Meanwhile, what you offered continues to compound. Depth grows. Consistency strengthens, authenticity matures. Even in your absence, the standard you set remains. Every shallow interaction they experience becomes a comparison they can't escape. Every lack of loyalty highlights what they forfeited. Every moment of instability reminds them of the foundation they walked away from. If you're wondering whether it was worth it to stay true instead of becoming easier to keep, here's your answer. Substance never begs for applause. It builds quietly while noise burns out. You were never meant to be clapped for by everyone. You were meant to be recognized by those capable of standing in truth. And the ones who chose the crowd over character are now left with echoes instead of connection. They thought the cheers meant they were winning. What they didn't realize is that real wins don't need an audience. And real losses don't show up immediately. They show up later when the noise fades and all that's left is the reality of what they traded away. Before we go any further, pause for a moment and recognize where you are right now. If this message is hitting, it's because you've lived it. You've felt the confusion, the disbelief, and the quiet strength that comes from choosing not to break. This isn't just a story you're listening to. It's an experience you've survived. And your perspective matters. What did you learn when someone chose the fake over what was real? What clarity did that loss give you? Share it. Put it into words. When you speak your truth, you don't just release it. You remind others that they're not alone and that strength grows when it's acknowledged. Number 4. They confused your silence with safety and miscalculated. They made a fatal mistake when they looked at your silence and assumed it meant safety. They thought quiet meant harmless, that composure meant compliance, that restraint meant you could be leaned on without consequence. That miscalculation is now costing them more than they expected. Patience in your hands was never weakness. It was discipline. It was awareness, choosing timing over impulse. But people who live reactively don't understand restraint. They mistake it for emptiness. They assume that because you didn't explode, you wouldn't leave. Because you didn't demand, you wouldn't withdraw. Because you stayed steady, you would stay forever. That's where they failed to read you. You weren't quiet because you lacked power. You were quiet because you had control over it. You didn't rush to prove your value because you already knew it. You gave space, not because you feared loss, but because you were observing. And while they were getting comfortable, you were getting clear. They interpreted your calm as unlimited access. They confused your understanding with tolerance, your consistency with disposability, and your emotional maturity with permission to test how far they could go. People who don't respect themselves often experiment with how much they can get away with. They push boundaries softly at first, then harder, watching for resistance. And when they didn't see immediate pushback, they assumed there wouldn't be consequences. They started cutting corners, stretching lines, treating loyalty like an option instead of a standard. Every time they crossed a line and you didn't react loudly, they told themselves a story that benefited them, that you would always be there, that you were flexible, that you'd adapt to whatever version of them showed up. What they didn't realize is that you were taking notes, not damage. Your patience was never infinite. It was intentional. It had limits anchored in self-respect. You weren't enduring disrespect, you were measuring character. You weren't ignoring the signs, you were letting patterns complete themselves. And that's the part that unsettles them now. They weren't exposed by confrontation, they were exposed by consistency. The more they assumed you'd stay no matter what, the more they revealed who they were when they thought there would be no cost. This is where time steps in, and time is unforgiving to illusions. Time doesn't get emotional. It doesn't negotiate. It simply shows outcomes. Every overlooked boundary, every assumption, every moment they believed you would bend was recorded. Not to punish them, but to clarify reality. And clarity always arrives, even if it's late. Especially if it's late. By the time they realized your silence wasn't safety, it was already over. The moment they crossed the line they didn't know existed, patience transformed into distance. Not chaos, not drama, distance. Because closure doesn't need volume, it needs certainty. And once that certainty arrived for you, access was gone, not out of spite, but out of alignment. You didn't disappear to teach a lesson, you stepped away because the lesson had already been taught. That's when regret began to settle in for them. Not loudly, not publicly, quietly. In the empty spaces where your presence used to steady things. In the moments where they expected you to still be there and realized you weren't. They tried to calculate what went wrong, replaying moments they once dismissed. They started measuring what they lost only after it was no longer available. And that's the harsh truth about patience. It is only recognized once it's gone. What they can't escape now is this realization. Patience cannot be replaced. Loyalty cannot be copied. Integrity doesn't come in substitutes. The fake they chose might imitate attention, but it cannot recreate steadiness. It can't hold ground under pressure. It can't challenge while supporting. It can't elevate without demanding growth. What you offered was rare because it required effort to keep, and effort was the one thing they avoided. So if you're wondering whether you waited too long or gave too much space, understand this. Your patience didn't cost you anything. It revealed everything. It showed you exactly who was worthy of access and who was only comfortable when they thought it was guaranteed. They didn't lose you because you were too forgiving. They lost you because they misunderstood the nature of your strength. Now they sit with the consequences of that misunderstanding. The silence they once took for granted now echoes. The stability they assumed was permanent is gone. And the truth they're forced to face is simple and unforgiving. Patience is not permission. It is a privilege, and they exhausted it. Number 5. The replacement reflected their ego. You reflected their reality. They didn't choose the replacement because it revealed anything meaningful about them. They chose it because it protected their ego. That's the part most people miss. What they ran toward wasn't love, depth, or alignment. It was permission. Permission to stay exactly as they were. Permission to avoid self-examination. Permission to keep believing the most convenient version of themselves without interruption. The replacement didn't reflect reality, it reflected preference. And preference is always softer than truth. What you brought into their life was not comfort, it was accuracy. You reflected their patterns, their inconsistencies, their strengths, and their gaps without ever needing to point them out. Simply being around you forced awareness. That's why it felt heavy to them. You didn't exaggerate who they were, but you also didn't minimize it. You showed them the full picture, and people who are still hiding from themselves find that unbearable. They don't want to be seen clearly. They want to be admired selectively. The replacement functioned like a flattering mirror in a dimly lit room. It showed them only what they wanted to see. Every shortcut was validated. Every excuse was normalized. Every inflated belief about themselves was reinforced. That kind of reflection feels soothing because it never interrupts identity. It never challenges habits. It never asks uncomfortable questions. It just agrees. And agreement feels like peace to someone who has been running from accountability. You were different. You didn't shapeshift to fit their mood. You didn't perform to maintain approval. You didn't exaggerate praise or ignore flaws to keep things smooth. Your presence had weight. It required honesty, consistency, and emotional presence. You didn't demand these things verbally, you embodied them. And embodiment is threatening to people who survive through performance. With you, pretending stopped working. That's why they labeled the replacement an upgrade. Not because it actually elevated their life, but because it reduced friction. It felt safer to be admired without being known. Safer to be validated without being challenged, safer to be seen as impressive rather than accurate. The replacement was easier to impress, easier to influence, and easier to manage. No growth was required, no internal work was triggered. That ease felt like relief, and relief often masquerades as happiness. But relief is temporary. Over time, the approval lost its flavor. The compliments stopped landing the same way. The agreement began to feel empty. What once felt affirming started to feel repetitive. Because admiration without depth eventually collapses into boredom. And boredom has a way of opening doors people thought they had locked forever. That's when regret quietly enters. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. They start noticing what's missing. The absence of real challenge, the lack of meaningful conversation, the shallow emotional exchanges, the way everything feels scripted instead of sincere. And without realizing it, they begin measuring every interaction against the standard you set. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real. You reflected substance, and substance leaves an imprint that imitation can't erase. This is where the realization sharpens. Losing you wasn't about losing affection or attention. It was about losing the only presence that held up a mirror they couldn't manipulate. You showed them who they were and who they could become at the same time. And walking away from that didn't just remove a person from their life, it removed a path forward. That's why the regret sticks. It's not emotional nostalgia, it's existential awareness. For you, this is the part that matters most. Their discomfort was never your responsibility. You were never meant to soften your truth to make someone else feel superior. Being chosen isn't about being liked, it's about being clear. It's about carrying a level of authenticity that exposes what's real, even when it costs you proximity. And while that can feel isolating in the moment, it guarantees one thing: you don't lose yourself to keep someone else comfortable. They can replace attention, they can replace company, they can replace noise, but they cannot replace a mirror that reflects truth without distortion. And once someone has seen themselves clearly, even briefly, they never fully forget it. That's why your impact lingers, not as a memory they revisit for comfort, but as a standard they can't escape. Number 6. Regret didn't show up when you left. It arrived when the mask slipped. Regret didn't rush in when you walked away. It waited. It stayed patient. It let them celebrate first. At the beginning, they felt untouchable. They convinced themselves they had escaped something heavy, something demanding, something that required effort. In their mind, they didn't lose you. They liberated themselves. They swapped depth for simplicity, truth for comfort, and called it peace. And for a while it worked. The noise distracted them. The surface-level attention kept them entertained. They mistook silence from accountability as relief and thought that meant progress. But regret has a specific timing. It doesn't show up during excitement. It arrives when pretending becomes exhausting, when the performance slips, when the energy they relied on starts running low. That's when the cracks appear. The laughter doesn't land the same. The conversations feel recycled. The connection starts sounding hollow. What once felt effortless begins to feel empty, and emptiness is loud when there's nothing real underneath it. This is where the shift happens. They begin noticing the gaps, the lack of substance, the absence of grounding. They realize the replacement can't carry weight when pressure enters the room. Loyalty feels conditional. Understanding feels shallow. Growth feels stalled. And without meaning or challenge, everything becomes repetitive. That's when they remember you, not romantically, not nostalgically, but accurately. They remember the stability you brought, the clarity you held, the way your presence didn't need constant validation to feel real. Chosen ones, this is important. Their regret isn't dramatic. It's private. It shows up late at night, in quiet moments, in the pauses they can't distract themselves from. Every attempt to recreate what you offered fails because it was never about effort. It was about authenticity. And authenticity can't be imitated under pressure. It either exists or it collapses. What they avoided now confronts them daily. The ease they chose has a cost, and the bill didn't arrive immediately. It arrived when the illusion expired, when convenience stopped being exciting, when comfort stopped feeling safe. That's when the weight of their decision settles in. Understand this clearly. Betrayal doesn't erase significance. It delays understanding. And when understanding finally arrives, it arrives with consequences. Their momentary win fades quickly. What you represented, consistency, depth, presence, doesn't. That's why their regret lingers, and that's why your silence speaks louder than anything you could have said. Number 7. They chased excitement and abandoned what actually lasts. They made the classic mistake of mistaking adrenaline for substance, noise for meaning, and sparks for structure. Excitement is seductive because it feels alive. It rushes in fast, fills the silence, and convinces people they've found something rare. Late nights feel electric. Messages feel urgent. Attention feels intoxicating. But excitement is a firework. It shines hard, burns fast, and leaves nothing behind once the smoke clears. They chased that rush because it required no discipline, no patience, and no inner stability. It rewarded impulse, not intention. And in doing so, they walked away from what actually endures. What you brought into their life wasn't loud, but it was real. You offered grounding, continuity, and a sense of direction that doesn't need constant stimulation to survive. That kind of presence doesn't shout for attention. It stands firm. Alignment doesn't beg to be noticed. It reveals itself over time. It's shown in how someone behaves when things get uncomfortable, when pressure enters the room, when there's nothing to gain by staying consistent. That's where real connection proves itself. And that's exactly where the fake falls apart. They confused intensity with compatibility. They assumed the rush they felt meant everything was right, that effort wouldn't be required, that maturity was optional. They believed momentum could replace values and chemistry could substitute for character. But energy without direction always burns out. What feels effortless in the beginning often collapses the moment life asks for responsibility. The excitement they chose had no backbone, no depth to lean on, no structure to survive stress. You, on the other hand, represented something slower but stronger. The kind of bond that doesn't need constant reassurance. The kind of understanding that deepens through challenges rather than dissolving under them. That intimidated them because it demanded presence, accountability, and growth. It required them to be consistent even when things weren't thrilling. And they weren't ready for that level of self-command. Now the contrast is unavoidable. When the novelty fades and the performance loses its shine, they're left facing the emptiness of what they chose. The excitement can't hold them steady. It can't offer vision, patience, or trust. And that's when regret settles in, not dramatically, but steadily. They realize too late that what lasts isn't built on sparks, but on alignment. And the foundation they abandoned is the very thing they can't replace. Number 8, you were stability they wanted without the responsibility. You were the kind of stability they craved but didn't have the discipline to carry, and that's the part that rewrites the entire story. Stability isn't about being boring, predictable, or easy to read. It's about showing up the same way under pressure as you do in comfort. It's about emotional control when chaos is tempting, principles when shortcuts are available, and consistency when walking away would be simpler. That's the energy you brought into their life. You didn't need to announce it. You embodied it. You were grounded when things were uncertain. You stayed aligned when moments tested character. And that alone separated you from everyone else they've ever dealt with. They didn't leave because stability wasn't attractive. They left because stability comes with responsibility. Being around you meant they couldn't hide behind excuses, distractions, or half-effort. It required maturity. It required self-awareness. It required ownership. And they weren't ready to carry that weight. They wanted the feeling of being secure without the work of becoming secure themselves. They wanted the benefits of reliability without the discipline that creates it. So instead of stepping up, they stepped sideways into something easier. The fake didn't require growth. It didn't demand reflection. It didn't challenge habits or call out inconsistencies. It offered agreement instead of alignment and comfort instead of character. That felt safer to them, not because it was better, but because it asked nothing. And in that moment, the version of life that asked nothing was the only one they could manage. You weren't rejected. You were avoided. Because being with you meant becoming someone they hadn't yet built the courage to be. What they didn't understand is that stability isn't replaceable. It isn't something you stumble into or recreate with surface-level charm. It's revealed under stress, tested in conflict, and proven over time. You weren't just someone they shared moments with. You became a reference point. Every interaction after you is now quietly measured against the calm, grounded presence you carried so naturally. And that's where regret begins to form. They thought leaving meant freedom. What they actually did was walk away from security they hadn't earned. When the excitement fades and the easy agreement stops feeling fulfilling, they're left facing the reality that real stability cannot be imitated. It must be built. And they lost access to it because they weren't willing to rise to the level it required. Number 9, they assumed your presence had no expiration date. They treated your presence like it came with unlimited renewals, and that assumption is exactly where everything collapsed. They moved with the quiet arrogance of someone who believes access is guaranteed, as if your patience had no edge and your loyalty had no limits. In their mind, time was a cushion. They thought they could stall, test, disappear, return, and still find you standing exactly where they left you. What they misunderstood is this: consistency does not equal permanence, and restraint does not mean surrender. You were choosing them every day, not waiting around by default. Chosen ones, understand this clearly. Your presence was never free. Every moment you gave, every ounce of energy you invested, every time you stayed calm instead of reactive, was a deliberate decision rooted in self-control and awareness. They mistook that discipline for availability. They confused your grounded nature with tolerance for disrespect. That was the fatal miscalculation. Because while you were steady, you were never stationary. While you were patient, you were always watching. Boundaries don't announce themselves, they reveal themselves when crossed. They operated as if accountability could be postponed and repaired later, as if betrayal was something that could be smoothed over with excuses and timing. They assumed forgiveness was automatic and consequences negotiable, so when the fake appeared, they convinced themselves they were making a flexible move, something temporary, something reversible. In their mind, you were the fallback, the constant, the option that didn't expire. But you were never a backup plan or a safety net. You were a privilege. The moment awareness clicked for you, everything shifted. You didn't argue your value, you didn't demand recognition, you simply removed access. Not as punishment, but as alignment. And that silence they now sit with isn't cruelty, it's cause and effect. They are learning, slowly and painfully, that what they assumed would always be there was actually rare, intentional, and finite. Now, regret follows them not because they miss company, but because they finally understand what they mishandled. The consistency they exploited cannot be recreated. The integrity they overlooked cannot be imitated. Every shallow interaction they entertain now highlights the depth they lost. They thought your presence had no expiration date. What they're discovering too late is that nothing valuable stays where it isn't respected. Number 10. The replacement made avoidance feel acceptable. What makes this kind of betrayal especially brutal is that it rarely comes from cruelty. It comes from avoidance. They didn't walk away because you were missing something. They walked away because being close to you demanded something from them they weren't prepared to give. Your presence required honesty. Your consistency required responsibility. Your awareness forced them to look at habits, patterns, and wounds they had spent years ignoring. And instead of confronting that reality, they looked for an exit that felt easier on their ego. Chosen ones understand this clearly. You represented forward motion. You embodied growth without announcing it. And that kind of energy is intimidating to people who survive by staying emotionally unfinished. Growth is uncomfortable. It asks questions people don't want to answer. It requires effort, humility, and the willingness to admit where you've been avoiding yourself. Most people say they want that, but when it shows up in the form of a real person, they panic. So they run toward someone who makes stagnation feel acceptable. The replacement didn't demand evolution. The replacement made excuses feel normal. Inconsistency was tolerated. Emotional immaturity was overlooked. Accountability was optional. They didn't have to reflect, repair, or rise. They could stay exactly as they were and still receive attention. That felt like freedom to them. But it wasn't freedom. It was permission to remain unhealed. And permission to stay broken always feels good at first, until life starts asking harder questions. This is where regret becomes unavoidable. Avoidance doesn't erase growth. It only postpones it. And postponed growth always comes back due, with interest. Over time, every shallow interaction exposes what's missing. Conversations feel thin, challenges feel heavier, emotional gaps become obvious. And without someone who pushes them forward, they begin to feel stuck in the same cycle they thought they escaped. You weren't just someone they lost. You were a reflection of who they could have become. That's the part that haunts them. Not the memories, not the moments, but the realization that they walked away from the version of themselves that would have required courage. They chose comfort over evolution, ease over transformation, and approval over truth. And while the fake fades, the lesson doesn't. Chosen ones, let this reframe everything. You were never optional in their growth story. You were the turning point they avoided. And that's why your absence lingers long after the shortcut stops working. Number 11. Their regret lives in places no one else can see. Their regret doesn't live where applause reaches. It doesn't announce itself in public spaces or dramatic confessions. It hides in the corners of their life where no one is watching and no one is listening. It shows up when the noise dies down, when distractions stop working, and when there's nothing left to perform for. In the late hours when the world goes quiet, during empty drives with no destination, in the pauses between conversations where silence gets uncomfortable, that's where it waits. And that's exactly why it hurts them so deeply. There's no audience to impress there, no image to maintain, no lie that fully holds. They can't parade this regret. They can't talk their way out of it without admitting what they actually did. Every recollection of what they let go of settles into them like weight they can't shake. What stings isn't just losing you. It's the realization that they knowingly traded something solid for something shallow and convinced themselves it was smart. They didn't just walk away from a person. They stepped away from depth and chose something easier to manage, easier to impress, and easier to replace. And they are painfully aware of that contrast now. They may look fine on the outside, they may laugh in public, stay busy, or surround themselves with noise. But internally, the comparison never stops. What they settled for keeps revealing its limits. The substitute doesn't carry substance. Praise fades quickly. Attention loses its flavor. And when the excitement wears off, reality steps in without mercy. The truth they avoided becomes unavoidable, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet realizations that stack up over time. The discomfort comes from recognition. They see now what kind of presence you were. You weren't just someone in their life. You represented clarity, consistency, and a level of authenticity that demanded maturity. Your absence forces them to confront their own decisions and the ceilings they chose to live under. That awareness doesn't scream, it lingers. It shows up in reflection, in memory, in moments when the replacement falls short, and there's no one else to blame. This type of regret doesn't burn fast. It smolders. It grows heavier as time passes because it can't be shared, fixed, or rewritten. No one claps for it. No one rescues them from it. It's the quiet consequence of choosing what felt easy over what was real. And while they sit with that truth in private, you move forward carrying the knowledge that being chosen was never about being kept. It was about being rare enough that losing you would always echo where no one else could hear it. Number 12. They learned too late. That loyalty has no substitute. They didn't understand the value of loyalty until they tried to live without it. And that lesson didn't arrive gently. It arrived through absence, inconsistency, and the slow realization that what they discarded cannot be replicated. Loyalty is not loud. It doesn't advertise itself or demand applause. It proves itself quietly through repetition, through presence, through showing up when it's inconvenient and staying steady when things stop being easy. That's what you carried naturally, and because you didn't announce it, they assumed it would always be there. Chosen ones, this is where the regret begins to sharpen. Loyalty isn't something you swap out like a preference. It isn't transferable. It isn't replaceable. Once it's broken, the space it leaves behind becomes obvious everywhere. The person they chose instead could offer excitement, agreement, and surface-level enthusiasm, but none of that holds weight when things get real. Attention fades, excitement fluctuates, agreement collapses under pressure. What remains is reliability, or the lack of it, and that's when they start noticing the difference. They begin to see how fragile the people around them really are, how quickly promises dissolve, how easily presence disappears when effort is required. The consistency you brought into their life is now missing, and every disappointment makes that absence louder. Trust becomes uncertain, integrity becomes questionable, loyalty, once assumed to be common, reveals itself as rare. And regret grows in those quiet gaps where stability should have been. Here's the truth they learned too late. Loyalty isn't about staying close when it's convenient. It's about choosing integrity when there's nothing to gain. It's about alignment when shortcuts are tempting. It's about truth when silence would be easier. You didn't just offer companionship, you offered dependability. You offered a standard of care that didn't fluctuate with mood, attention, or circumstance. That kind of presence can't be duplicated by effort or intention once it's gone. They can't rewind the moment they took it for granted. They can't reconstruct the trust that was given without conditions. What they lost wasn't just a person, it was certainty. The quiet confidence of knowing someone was solid, consistent, and real. That realization settles in slowly, but it stays. Loyalty isn't something people appreciate when they have it. It's something they recognize only when it's missing. And by the time they understand that truth, the opportunity to honor it is already gone. And this is where everything comes full circle. What you've heard isn't just a story about betrayal, regret, or replacement. It's a reminder of who you are and why your presence carries weight. You were never meant to be interchangeable, and anyone who chose convenience over depth will eventually feel the cost of that decision. If this message sparked clarity or gave words to something you've been carrying, support this work by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Share your support through Super Thanks so our team can continue creating bold, honest, and life-shifting content like this. Most importantly, drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here, and your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to read.